Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. My name's Kev Cooling, your host, founder and MD of Hut22 Limited. And I'm really excited today to be joined by Anna Sturtivant, Sustainability Manager at the BBC. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Kev.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. Excellent. And glad it's a Friday. As you said, happy Friday.
Yes, happy Friday.
We've known each other for quite a few years, and we used to work together, didn't we, quite a few years ago. But of course, not everybody knows you. I don't know why. I mean, they should do. But so I wonder what would be great, actually, is if you could just give our listener, I mean, maybe I should say listeners, but I don't want to over-egg the pudding. So maybe you could give everybody listening a quick potted history, maybe, of how you've got to become a sustainability manager at the BBC over the last however many years that's taken.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, since we spoke earlier, I've learnt my career was longer than I thought it had been. But yeah, I've had a few different jobs, but I think it all really kicked off. I think I was picking my GCSEs, and I always wanted to be an architect. That was my goal, and led me to picking all of my subjects at GCSE and A level to get me into university to study that. And then when I got there, I ended up studying something slightly different. So I still had the architecture, and I added in environmental engineering, which was great because then I actually learned more about how buildings actually work, more of a holistic view, focus on sustainability, renewable energy, sustainable design. But that's where my kind of love for buildings comes from, I suppose. And that's really my angle on sustainability, I would say. So that was great, 4-year undergrad. And then my graduate role, as you know, was in the sustainable development team, in AECOM in consultancy. And yeah, that role, again, very buildings focused, operational energy efficiency, scope 1 and 2 decarbonisation, building optimization. I feel like that's the sort of category of sustainability. Is that fair? Is that what we did?
I think so. My memory is maybe a little bit hazy, but yes, I think that's exactly what we did.
Excellent. And then I think because I'd always been so focused on working in something to do with, wanting to be an architect, but then still working in buildings, I felt like I needed to shake it up a little bit and check that was still what I wanted to do.
Just let me take a little rain check.
And then started to think about career in public sector and what it might be like to work on the other side of that kind of private public divide. And I took a job,
and also not only that, going from consultancy role to a client side role. So you're not only going from private to public sector, but because you could have been a client in the private sector, couldn't you? Of course you could.
Yeah, definitely. And my sort of entry in was as a civil servant in DEFRA, and I was working on the Environment Bill at the time, on environmental governance. So this was so different. I mean, it felt really different to me because it was nothing to do with buildings, and it was all around kind of policy making and working on a bill. I mean, it was a great kind of, window into how policy making works inside central government. But it wasn't my didn't really match my education and experience in that way, I suppose.
In your sustainability niche.
Or
niche, as the Americans say.
But what it did confirm was that I do really like buildings, and I do want to make buildings more sustainable. So I stayed in the civil service, but then I took a different role in what was BEIS, which has now been split into different departments. But Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, that's what it was called then. And I worked in estates sustainability. So that was quite similar to the role I was doing in consultancy at AECOM, but kind of in-house then, and working towards making the department more sustainable from an operational point of view. So reducing our energy consumption, emissions, and starting to look into other parts of sustainability as well. So staff engagement, comms, waste and recycling and circularity, and also starting to look into scope 3 and supply chain.
Ooh, yes.
Yep, the big one. And then from there, I, a couple of years ago now, moved to the BBC and started my current role as a sustainability manager. So again, fairly kind of similar in terms of what might be written in the job description, but focusing on buildings and energy, working on our scope 1 and 2 decarbonisation. And that's what keeps me busy now.
Brilliant. Sounds great. I mean, it's quite the move. I think there's more movement from being a consultant in this space to being a client in the space rather than the other way around. I think I do know people who've gone the other way actually, but but there definitely seems to be more people who kind of go that way than the other way. So what strikes me about your career, particularly since you left ACOM, is that you've been working in large and complex organizations the whole time, really. I know at DEFRA maybe you were kind of more focused on the policy side rather than the kind of the corporate side of DEFRA, but nonetheless every organization is unique, right? I mean, I know that's true, but I'm imagining, and certainly my experience is that there are some challenges with large complex organizations when you're trying to take action on sustainability. So what do you think kind of the main challenges are in that sort of situation?
I personally find a lot of it does come down to the people, and picking your stakeholders. So finding the right people to engage with. Sometimes it's quite clear, even if it's a really big organization, depending on how it's structured, I suppose, and to what level of seniority sustainability is already being discussed and tabled, and objectives set. That obviously changes depending on where you are. So I think finding the right people, but also having to understand that everybody's just trying to do their own job, right? Everybody's got their own priorities. They might already be competing, and then bringing sustainability into the mix and kind of trying to put it to the top of the agenda cannot be totally straightforward.
No, that's that. Of course, you're absolutely right. And when you say the right people, do you mean the right roles, or do you mean actually the individuals who are, I don't know, it's always the case, isn't it, that in any organization you get some people who are really enthusiastic, and is that the sort of person you mean, or do you mean that those particular roles within an organization that happen to be really pivotal, or both?
Great question. Yeah, I think both, actually, now that you've articulated it like that. So you've got the roles, I suppose, around how senior are they, where do they sit in the decision making tree of the organization.
Yeah, right.
Getting engagement from the right roles in the right type of teams, I suppose. So your property teams, technology, your finance, your human resources, but then staff as well. I feel like this is often where a lot of the enthusiasm comes from. Trying to match those two together, I don't think is really straightforward. Sometimes you've got your kind of corporate strategy, maybe, that you're focused on getting those roles really engaged with, and embedding sustainability in that way. But the energy and the shift in culture has to come from your staff as well, and it's the people then, isn't it? It's the kind of individuals harnessing what they care about and their drive and ambition to make things better, trying to bring all that together in one way, which is obviously where the comms team helps to come in.
No, absolutely.
Another critical team.
Right. One thing I'm interested in is, in those big organizations, there's any number of people to choose from that you might want to go and sit down and have a coffee with and try and persuade them that a more sustainable approach is a better approach. How do you identify them? Do you do it from a kind of I could see that you might do it from a numbers point of view. So once you've established what your inventory is, your carbon footprint, you might say actually this team are responsible for a big slice of the pie, therefore I really need to engage with them. Or is there another way of figuring out who it is you should be engaging with?
I think in my experience it is that way of looking at who's responsible for what and how does that match up with your footprint and maybe the targets that you're trying to meet. I mean, you can't kind of really set your targets and strategy without talking to those people in the first place. So it is quite a lot of, I mean, it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? But at least a lot of back and forth. It's an ongoing conversation that you need to have with those people. I suppose I've been quite fortunate in that the roles I've gone into in operational sustainability in estates, we've already had some kind of sustainability team already established. So I'm quite lucky that some of the hard work has been done for me.
Nice. Good choice.
Yeah. Sorry,
so you're not starting from scratch, right? You're not starting from scratch.
I haven't started from scratch. No.
And you know what? I think these days, in a large organization, I think very few people would be starting from scratch, right? There's something, even if back in the midst of time when this stuff first started to come about, we were always talking to energy managers, or it's almost always somebody in the estates team somewhere, the property team somewhere, and often an energy manager, and their remit kind of tended to grow, which maybe leads me on to my next question, actually, because one of the things that I've recognized in large organizations is that responsibility, maybe because historically it kind of grew out of the energy manager role. They end up having responsibility for energy and carbon and then reducing those things, but they absolutely don't have control over the way that energy is used necessarily. I mean, sure, buildings, yes, maybe they've got some control over that, but especially when you mentioned scope 3 before, when you start to expand your remit and think about scope 3, that's all about almost nothing about buildings, really. That's about all the other stuff that goes on in the organization. So that idea of any strategy that you put in place needing to kind of increase the reach and penetration of those people and increase their influence is really important. So how do you kind of think about that idea of influencing and supporting? Well, actually, I was going to say supporting them to do it, but of course it's you, right? You're responsible for it, right? Is that right?
Well, I'm responsible for a part of it, I guess.
Yeah.
But there's just so many people that have a role to play in it. And I think just going back to what you said about, the roles often starting in kind of energy management and for the buildings, that's what's been such a new thing for me, really, or, something I've seen change quite a lot, over the years, is that for me, sustainability is sustainable buildings. And I always come from that side of things. But, now sustainability teams have leads for so many different kind of avenues within that, also depending on what the organization is, I suppose. So whatever their kind of core business is, you might have people that change it. I mean, influencing those people, I do think having the sort of objectives, targets, strategy set in place from a sort of central point is really key. But then it's making those targets relevant to the people that need to take action to deliver on them. And I think being able to talk in their language is really important, and understand what their day job is, what their priorities are. Often, I think when you have the targets in large organizations, it might end up coming down to, well, how does this make sense from a business decision and money? To other people, that's not the case. But I think sort of understanding more about their role, linking it to what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's really valid. I mean, it also comes back to that thing you said before about making sure that when you're developing a strategy, you're not doing that in isolation somewhere. You're not kind of sat in a darkened room, kind of just beavering away, building this strategy. You need to involve people in that process and make sure that they are part of developing it. So it's almost like they kind of got no choice but to take some ownership, right?
Yeah. And I think with the sort of strategy that's maybe coming from the centre, or whoever's responsible for setting it, but having your targets supported by the science helps. There's obviously a lot of frameworks, and you've got Science-Based Targets Initiative and all sorts of regulatory and policy related things to point to. But personally, I find that having those targets supported by science helps to give you more of a kind of story and a narrative to help explain why it's important, and we're not just coming at this cold because it's a good thing, but there's so many reasons out there as to why it's important that we do this.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, that notion of the science-based target thing has been, I think, incredibly useful to move the conversation on, because historically it was so much a conversation about doing it because it feels like the right thing to do, but there was nothing really underpinning it. It was access to the science was very difficult, but now through the SBTI, that is made, and other things like CREM and whatever, that's kind of made access to the science so much easier, and kind of gives you a really strong foundation for having those conversations, as you say. One of the other things I've noticed is that having that strategy in place, and maybe having policy in place, particularly this, I think policy is particularly falls foul of this in some ways. Having policies in place in and of itself doesn't achieve a lot. My experience is what that does is it gives you a mandate to have that conversation. So you've got a basis to go and talk to somebody in their own language, which I find is so important, isn't it?
Definitely. And I think if it's the CEO of a company who has decided to set a net zero strategy or a sustainability strategy, amazing. It's often not necessarily come into the business or the organization that way, but it's, somewhere else in the organization that is responsible for this area. And yeah, having those policies and regulations, you're right, does just opens a door, I think. And it's
Yeah,
that
I think
sort of
that's right.
age-old combo of your carrot and your stick, and which one you need more of at certain times. And yeah,
having all those things in your toolbox is important, I think, isn't it? Kind of recognizing that you both need you need both those things. We also talked before about this idea of the energy for this change, this transformation, this transition through to a more sustainable way of operating, coming from the staff, the general kind of body of people who are part of the organization. I think that's absolutely right. But you kind of think about, and I talked about this before, I think, on one of the other shows, but you kind of have this Rogers diffusion curve, don't you? And you know that the innovators, there's always going to be somebody in an organization doing something, irrespective of what the policy says, because they're really interested in it. And kind of harnessing that and kind of making the most of that self-selecting audience and encouraging that early majority to get on board and everything else, super important. But similarly, there'll always be people at the other end of the curve who are kind of laggards, who you'll really find difficult to convince. And that's okay, I suppose. You could waste a lot of time and energy trying to influence them. But what if those people are decision makers? You mentioned decision makers before. What do you think about that? Is there other ways? Are there kind of levers? Are there mechanisms that you can use to really kind of bring those people on board?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things is having time and patience. It's quite a,
Right, okay.
I mean, it's quite a thing to get your head around sometimes. And if this is being thrown at you, or all of a sudden you've got to start making decisions about, your area of responsibility, but for a different set of, targets and
Different set of
initiatives,
criteria or whatever. Yeah.
it must be quite challenging. And I personally just try and have a lot of understanding of other. I mean, I don't know what other people's jobs are necessarily, but understanding that they've got their own job to do still. So again, it's that kind of talking in their own language. I mean, something else that I think is good to do is about how you use data or how you use results to tell a story rather than necessarily shock people. There's been a lot out there, loads of research, and I feel like I hear about it all the time about this, shocking people about climate change versus giving them hope about what a better future might look like, and how, where the balance is with that. And I think it's different for different people. We're all on that kind of, spectrum between the two, aren't we?
Yeah.
And some days even it might change a little bit about what resonates with people. I suppose it kind of keeps coming down to comms.
So I was going to say that you mentioned a couple of times this idea of talking people's language. Can you maybe are you able to give me some examples of that, and kind of what do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah. So working in estates teams, the role of an estates team is huge. I have found, and I think literally making the buildings run so that people have an office to go to, or making other operations work. So say you're talking to your head of estates and you're trying to encourage them to implement some sustainability initiatives. We might still be at the stage of LED lighting, or we might be thinking, well, can we look at our heating system and look into heat pumps, or is it time to rationalize the estate? And I might be coming at it from a sustainability perspective, but they might be looking at it from a lease ending points.
Yeah.
And you can, this is why I think it works quite easily with buildings. If you're saving energy and greenhouse gas emissions from implementing those initiatives, you are literally saving money as well. So if the person who's in charge of deciding what happens in the buildings is a budget holder, then that's a way to speak in their language.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. From the outside as a consultant, right, and you'll remember this, I'm sure. It looks, lots of businesses look the same, right? They've all got emissions. Yeah, they come from slightly different places, but they've all got emissions. They all use energy. They all do whatever it is that causes emissions. The process of quantifying those emissions is largely the same. There's nuance and all that. Sure, but it's not until you get into an organization that you start to realize actually there are nuances on there. There are kind of drivers for them that aren't the same as other organizations. So in HE, a really good example is the way that the kind of reporting that they're required to do, for example, or just the language about, I know they don't exist anymore, but back in the day it might have been something around HEFKE where they get some of their funding, or it might have been the way that universities think about their students, and those are really a really particular set of, it's a really particular context. And similarly, I've done work in manufacturing, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and understanding the impact of having a product licensed or not licensed is important. So there's loads of different nuance, and actually just even kind of understanding that and being able to talk about that and understand when someone says, oh, well, of course, that thing's licensed, so we won't be able to change the manufacturing process. Understanding that and thinking, okay, fine, that's a constraint on them. Therefore, I need to kind of adapt what I'm saying or whatever, or we need to work with them to find a way around that. So I think that talking their language is super, super important for influencing them to do what it is you need them to do.
One of the other things around, this kind of speaking their language, or I suppose really what I'm getting at is connecting with people in a way that's effective. And another way to do that, and I think of it because, you mentioned being adaptable, is how technical are the people that you're talking to? How much knowledge do they already have of sustainability and what net zero means? And adjusting and adapting what you're saying to match their level of knowledge in that area, I think is so, so important. And it does come back to this using data to tell a story. Hard numbers and facts and stats work really, really well for some people, but for other people, they need more of a story and a journey to kind of follow along with. So I think language variations in kind of level of complexity is very important, but takes a bit of time to kind of get a feel for it and get it right.
No, I think that's right, and I think that comes with experience, doesn't it? It comes with understanding. Almost straight away, as soon as you start talking to somebody, you can understand very quickly, okay, I need to be pitching what I'm saying in this way or at this level. And it's important. Do you find then that there are benefits to, and I don't know if this has been true in any of the places that you've worked, but benefits to having some kind of education program where you kind of increase people's literacy around this whole thing so that people have at least a kind of a base level of understanding? I mean, not everybody needs to understand everything about carbon emissions, of course they don't, but they got a base level understanding of what activities actually cause the impact and all that kind of stuff. Have you found that useful?
Yeah, definitely. I think getting that base level of knowledge and just the kind of words, that literally the language that's used. I think obviously when you work in this area, you're just so used to using them all the time. Scope 3, you just know it, but not everybody has anything to do with it or would really know what it means, or they might know what it means by definition, but they might not really know what how big the net is and what it really covers. I think there's loads of ways that can be done, whether it's by fairly kind of targeted training to certain people, like adapted for their job, or if it's kind of flat thing across organizations, a sort of base level of carbon literacy, if you like, or kind of softer things, and that actually there's just sort of comms and visuals and the language kind of trickles in softer ways that you don't kind of really realize, like you don't feel like you're being taught something, but you slowly start to pick up on it because it's kind just of becoming a bit of the everyday norm. Yeah,
totally. And that idea of, and what about comms then? So I mean, you mentioned before that the comms team are really important in large organizations. How so?
Well, I suppose we can split it into internal and external in the first place, and externally telling the world what you're doing and how important it is. But internally, this is really what I was getting at. Because in very large organizations, it's very hard as an individual or even as a team, just somewhere in the organization, to get messages out to staff. So if you've got initiatives that you're thinking of doing, or maybe it's, I don't know, a survey, or you just need to share some news, or you're just trying to make people aware, I have found that the internal comms teams are the ones with the channels to be able to do that. Some work more effectively than others. I can't just go putting up posters on a building. Sorry,
I interrupted. I shouldn't have done that. Right. But do you mean some types of channel are more effective than others? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, there was me using another set of
there you
lingo,
go.
probably.
There you
go. But it's exactly that. It's you've got so many options at your disposal potentially. direct emails to staff, intranet pages. There might be digital screens around buildings. A lot of the times you find them in lifts or like lift lobbies, physical posters, general signage. I mean, everything really. And obviously that is kind of managed by a comms team, typically in very large organizations, which I think also has the added benefit of, if you're trying to communicate sustainability from a corporate perspective, to me it makes sense that it goes through a comms team, because then it matches the tone and language and style, so it it automatically maybe has another layer of messaging over it without you really having to do it. And almost on the other side of that is that if you also have comms, and this maybe more of an engagement tool of volunteer green teams, and this is a way that staff can get involved, you almost want the opposite of that, and you need that communication engagement that comes from that side of things to be maybe a bit more personal and feel a bit more tangible, and not have that kind of corporate layer over it. So I think there's several ways that it can be a really effective tool to get people on board and involved, and even just aware sometimes.
We know, don't we, you and I, we used to work with a guy, Richard Tetlow, the famous Mr. Tetlow, who did an engineering doctorate which focused on behavior, and one of the things that Rich used to say a lot, and it's absolutely true, and kind of other research I've been involved with backs it up 100%, is that increasing awareness is okay, but actually there's no real correlation between people being aware of something and actually doing stuff. So have you kind of found any really kind of effective levers that make it more likely that people are going to do the thing that you want them to do? Because that's kind of what it's all about, right? You ultimately, you've got a thing you need to achieve. That's your job. So you're just trying to do your job. And in order to do that, though, you can't run around turning the lights off in every room, can you? So somebody needs to be doing it. So have you found any kind of levers or techniques and things that help in that respect?
Yeah, I think maybe one way to kind of tackle it could be having shared projects, I suppose. So in a lot of things that might be implemented from the center, if I call that in inverted commas, that might be about literally changing something around the building. It might be actually changing the bins, or okay, let's just go with bins. And you need staff to use them effectively so that the organization as a whole can meet their targets around improving their recycling and reducing their waste. So there's kind of some of the sort of stuff is already done by estates, but then getting people to use them effectively does rely on the staff. So I think using their position within teams, they're already embedded into the organization, so you haven't got to then try and embed yourself in the organization to help deliver training and share skills, speak up at their team meetings and tell people about what's happening and why. And I mean, it's not going to fix everything. You can't get everybody to recycle properly overnight. We definitely know that. But that, I think that is one way to maybe kind of have a shared project between centre and staff.
That's interesting, because one of the other pieces of research this wasn't Rich's research, this was somebody else, but one of the things that we were looking at was this idea of goal alignment. So a really common plank in the sustainability manager's armory are the kind of carbon champions or the green champions or whatever, environmental champions, whatever you want to call them. And they're great. They're typically kind of a self-selecting group, aren't they? They're people who are interested. So you're relying on their goodwill in order to be able to achieve whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And what the research found was that's great. But what makes them super effective is if those goals that they've been given, which are normally over and above their actual core work, in fact almost always they're over and above their core work, are actually built into what they're held to account for. So part of their appraisal, so they've got those goals in there as part of their appraisal, because that I say automatically, that kind of means, certainly at the very least it implies, hopefully it's explicit, that they should have time to do those things. So that makes it so much more effective if you can align those goals. I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, definitely.
You mentioned external comms.
Mm.
And I'm intrigued by that because in recent years, it's been so much more the case that people are coming out, and particularly, with the rise of net zero, people are coming out
Yeah.
and saying, making net zero declarations, making net zero targets and that kind of stuff. And as soon as you do that publicly, presumably for most organizations, that kind of puts you on the hook straight away, right? Because you've
Hmm.
said publicly, we're going to do this by 2030, 2035, 2040, whatever it is. And how much do you find? I mean, I know the government is slightly different because that's kind of got a different set of targets, I suppose. But do you find that in your experience, when you talk to, people, other people, or in your experience, do you find that that's quite a powerful driver or not so much?
Yeah, I think you put yourself on the hook and it makes you keep yourself accountable for it. And I would probably put that in, the toolbox of sustainability teams to help make change happen. Yeah, you've got your kind of headline targets, which you can shout about and you can put out there. And another way that, is fairly common with public sector organizations, at least, is the annual reports where,
Yeah,
tend to go into a bit more detail, maybe more commitments, and add a bit of narrative around specifically what it is that they're working on.
yeah,
I think it's really useful. It just forces you to stop being cautious, or you're still
mm,
cautious maybe in your delivery, but I have talked to quite a lot of people about this, really, and just at some point kind of jumping in and saying, right, we're doing it, and then
yeah,
now we're gonna deliver it. And I would caution that, the slight other side of the coin to that is setting targets before you know if you can do it. I think there's a whole other debate there around which way around it goes, or if it has to be a bit of one and a bit of the other. And I feel like that is something that did happen, is that everybody sort of came out with their net zero targets, maybe without loads of thought about how they were going to deliver on them, and potentially have had to backtrack.
yeah.
I think there's been quite a lot in the news about that, but that's where maybe SBTI helps, and other policies to just sort of give that rubber stamp of approval that this is right.
I think that's a really valid observation, actually. I remember being in a committee meeting, and traditionally the conversation was always, when it came to carbon reduction, okay, how much can we reasonably reduce our emissions based on both their technical feasibility and the financial viability of whatever it is we think we're doing. So, we've got this much money to spend. How much carbon reduction can we get for that? And I remember somebody on the committee challenging and saying, actually, do you know what? It shouldn't be that way, should it? Surely we should be saying, how much do we need to reduce our carbon, and then working out how we're going to do it. So, and this was just about when the concept of net zero was just starting to come about. So it's like, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago, whatever it was. And that for me was a really kind of powerful moment, because that's exactly right. I mean, ultimately, the science says that we've got this finite fixed amount of carbon we can produce. So it kind of has to be that we know where we need to get to. How do we get there? But I absolutely take your point that so many organizations just said, right, yeah, we're going to be net zero by 2030 without giving it really any thought at all. And that's fine, I suppose. I mean, that's one way to drive action for sure, especially if you make a public thing. But actually, a lot of them have to kind of publicly come out and say, actually, no, I don't think we can do it. Then we're going to have to roll it back. We're going to have to push back a few years or whatever it might be. So I think there's definitely something to be said for the power of making that public commitment and being bold and saying, yep, we're going to do it. But also kind of you've then got to back it up and say, oh yeah, right, okay, now we need to figure out what that means.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when you work in this sector, you can understand what it means for somebody to maybe look like they're rolling back a target, or actually they maybe set a target, and the second pass at that is that now they're being more specific about it. So maybe it's
Yeah,
not everything, and I'm not a comms or a PR person, and it'd be very interesting to kind of look into this a bit more, I think. But and I'm sure loads and loads of people have, it's already all out there, but yeah, understanding that impact of like using the language, if for something out there in the public domain, can be quite different to what that you're actually working and delivering on
yeah,
inside an organization, because of how other
yes,
people maybe interpret it, is maybe a bit of a tricky one.
yeah. That's a good point. I think the thing that's true about net zero, let's take net zero as an example. I mean, that's really the only game in town, isn't it, now, when it
Yeah.
comes to carbon targets. So if you're an organization and you say we're going to be net zero by whatever date, what I think a lot of organizations haven't grasped, even the ones who have been quite considered in the way they've done that, is just how fundamental a shift that is going to require in order to be able to hit that target. It really does mean unpicking everything the organization does and thinking, okay, how can we do every one of these things a bit differently, or even a lot differently. And I think it's that understanding that organizations suddenly come to and suddenly think, blimey, we're not going to be able to do this. It's going to cost a fortune, or whatever the reasoning is that they're not going to be able to do it. But yeah, that the level of change, I think, is something that most organizations, I'm going to say, haven't really got to grips with at the moment. So let's assume that you're an organization, you've got this net zero target, or even maybe, I mean, net zero is a narrow band of sustainability, right? It's much broader than that. It could be all any sort of sustainability issue, I suppose. You've made this public commitment. You've got people on board, at least in terms of, they've signed off on the target. You're somebody who has been given the responsibility for implementing it, particularly across a large and complex organization. There are going to be, presumably, some big bear traps that you want to try and avoid. What do you are there any that you've come well, are there any I don't know if you're willing to say, but are there any you've fallen into? Are you still nursing a bad leg after having it clamped in some kind of trap?
Not quite, no, but definitely.
Oh, good.
Definitely.
That's very good news, Anna. Thank you.
But I think there are a few. For me personally, and what I've kind of observed and how I've felt working in these types of places. But yeah, this whole thing around culture change and systems change, and like you said, sort of unpicking the way the whole organisation works is a lot. And sort of coming back to this point of having to bring sustainability, whatever the issue is, into other people's work and not imposing it onto them, making it make sense for other people, I think, is the only way that you can really get a natural shift in culture and system change for this area. And not underestimating the time it takes. I think it, even in small organizations, it is a huge undertaking. Like I said at the start, just finding the right people, that can take ages, and you haven't even really done anything at that point. It's it's a huge task. Engaging people, it can be really time consuming, even delivering the projects. Like, it's not an overnight thing that you change all your lighting to LED in your whole estate, and that's probably only, I don't know, 2% of your greenhouse gas emissions footprint. I'm sorry, I keep coming back to buildings and net zero because that's what okay. I know about.
It's good. It illustrates the point, doesn't it?
But I suppose in another way, there's a kind of positive spin on that, in that it can feel really overwhelming. And I know when you had Kat on, and the sort of topic of overload and burnout comes up, and I see this all the time now, in the news, and I've certainly definitely felt it myself, that the task feels so huge, but with that comes so much potential, and especially because it is around system and culture change, and it's not quick fixes. There are some quick fixes that you can do to get yourself on that journey, and then help you tell your own story to kind of garner enthusiasm. But ultimately that helps you work towards a much bigger goal, which is what we're all here for, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, actually. But it's so often the start of the journey are those technical fixes, those quick wins, aren't they? Because quite often they're a bit more in control of the person who's been given the responsibility. So, for instance, somebody in estates, so they can control projects like you say, LED lighting, or changing the boiler for a heat pump, or whatever it might be. So that tends to be in control, and it's kind of a technical fix, and it's something that doesn't really disrupt the organization in any way. You don't really need to think differently about how you deliver whatever your core purpose is, whether you've got a fluorescent light over your head or an LED light over your head, right? That doesn't really make a difference.
Yeah.
So, but it's when you get beyond that actually things start to get a bit tougher, a bit trickier, and that's where you need, as you say, that you need to be able to fall back on the good progress you've made so far to tell a really good story, or you need to have spent the time whilst you're doing that stuff building relationships with other people, because then it becomes much more about things like how you spend budgets, which is like so important. And you mentioned before again about the scope 3 stuff, and how we all know, you and I know, and people in the field know, that is probably 80, 90, more percent of an organization's footprint. So that being the case, suddenly the way you spend budgets becomes super important, because the lion's share of that is your supply chain, right?
Yeah, you're spending money, and you're not necessarily going to spend less money to meet your carbon targets. That might be feasible for some people, but certainly not for most, especially, organizations that are growing, and businesses as well, and they're delivering. So
so that, I suppose that the challenge is that for most people in an organization, carbon isn't the thing that they're trying to achieve. That's not it. It is, delivering an education program, or it is making a TV program, or it is developing policy, or it is, running a prison, or it is, being a solicitor, or whatever it is. So all of those things, that's their core work, that's their job. And you're adding something onto that, adding a layer onto that kind of just makes everything just a bit harder, a bit more complex. And if you're going to put restrictions on the way that they can spend their money, then that of course just makes it even more difficult. And you fall back again to that thing you talked about building relationships with people. You can talk about it in their language, so they're able to make better choices rather than not.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely my approach. I think there are many out there. My approach works for me, coming from that angle, of building those relationships, because then
I think it's super important.
Yeah, and it's not then that you get, you might start building that relationship because you've got a specific task to deliver, but actually, if you've done it in the right way, then you've just set your own foundation for doing even more and making it even better. So I think it's definitely the right way to do it. It feels, like a kind of slow way of doing things a lot of the time, I think, because you have to build that trust, learn a lot about other people and the way that the organization works. But you're just setting yourself up to do well, I think, if you take it from that side of it.
Like so many things, it comes back to people again, doesn't it? It comes back to having good working relationships with people and being able to influence. Maybe that's a good place to stop and just sort of think, just reflect on the fact that actually, being a sustainability person, whether it's in-house or a consultant or whatever, is really about building. You've got to have that technical knowledge that's really useful, obviously, but it's so much about building relationships and influencing people. Anna, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great to have a chat. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's been great. All right, take care.
Thanks, Kev.